Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another book review. And today we are going to be reviewing the second book on the Castle Rock tour. From 1981, we are going to be reviewing Stephen King's Cujo. Now let's get the particulars out of the way. This was written in 1981, and the original hardcover clocks in at 309 pages. Okay? Now, as you all may have known by watching my reviews, my favorite Stephen King book of all time that he's ever written is It. And a lot of people ask me, which is the book that I dislike? You have the best book of Stephen King and the book that you don't really like at all. Well, here we are. I really did not like Cujo. This is only the second time, maybe the third time in my life that I've actually read this book. And we'll talk about it. I know Stephen King himself likes Cujo. He enjoys Cujo. He just wishes he could remember writing Cujo, because this was written at a time when Stephen King was drinking very heavily. And if you read his book on writing, he talks about not actually remembering writing Cujo, and he kind of wishes that he could remember writing the good parts, because this is a book of his that he actually enjoys. So the story of Cujo is very simple. It revolves around two families, both of them in Castle Rock. It revolves around Vic and Donna Trenton, who has a little child named Tad, who has moved up from New York to the town of Castle Rock. Vic owns an advertising business. They relocated to a small Maine town. And the other family are the Cambers, which is Joe and Charity Camber and their son Brett. And Joe and Charity Camber are the one that own the giant St. Bernard Cujo. Joe is the local automotive. He has his own business. He fixes cars. And as we know, the whole meat of the story is that Donna and Tad bring their Pinto over to Joe's garage to have it fixed, and that's where they are trapped by the rabid Cujo for a couple of days. A lot of the time is Donna and Tad in the car being assaulted by Cujo. So let's just talk a little bit about the story. Both families are dealing with sort of their own issues. The Trentons are dealing with Vic's advertising business is failing. He's got some issues going on there. He just found out that his wife had an affair. She'd called it off, and the man that she was having an affair with didn't like that very much. So he decided to write Vic a nasty note saying, I was having an affair with your wife. So on the one hand, you've got the Trentons, where the marriage is failing, the business is potentially failing. So he has a lot on his plate, and his son, 4-year-old Chad, believes that there's a monster in his closet. That there's some creature living in his closet that just tried to eat him. And so they're dealing with that. And the Camber family is just sort of your typical, country folk. Joe owns his own business. He fixes automotives. He's a local mechanic. And Charity, she's dealing with Joe, her husband, who is both physically and sort of emotionally abusive, both to her and not so much to the son, but she's afraid that her son is going to grow up to be just like his father, who's going to grow up to be that type of person who thinks it's okay to talk to anybody the way they want, physically abuse anybody the way they want, basically do whatever they want. So they're sort of dealing with that. And they're the one that has the dog, Cujo, the 200-pound St. Bernard. And at the very beginning of the story, Cujo chases a rabbit into a hole, gets bit by a bat, and bat has rabies, and now we have this story, and it's not, in my opinion, it's a good story, but it's not gripping. It took me way longer to read this book than it should have. The main gist of the story is Cujo getting bit and slowly going rabid, and then what he does to the humans around him as he begins to sort of terrorize and kill some of the, he winds up killing a neighbor, and he winds up killing a few other folks until it culminates with him basically sieging Donna and Tad in the car in the middle of July. And it's very hot, and when they go, and that's sort of like the siege, the stand, that all builds up. That's when he's at the height of his rabies, and that's the standoff. It's Donna versus the dog in the doorway of the Chambers dooryard, and that story in and of itself is a pretty good story. The idea of, up to this point, you've had, Stephen King has dealt with humans and human beings that have gone slowly mad, and human beings that have turned evil, and human beings that have gone slowly psychotic and have done evil things to other human beings. And this is the first time that we see him take on a dog who now has rabies, and he's slowly devolving, and he's slowly going crazy, and he's slowly going mad, he's slowly becoming violent, until he finally snaps and turns and starts to go after some people, and we have the final climactic battle. That story is pretty good. The story just of the dog and the siege and the standoff and what the dog does isn't a bad story. The problem is the book doesn't just focus on that. The book spends a very large amount of time talking about Vic's failing advertising business, talking about Vic's trip to New York to save said failing advertising business, spends a lot of time talking about the affair, spends a lot of time talking about Donna's affair with Stephen Kemp and the ramifications of that, spends a lot of time talking about the Chambers' personal lives, and at one point Charity wins the lottery, and she takes some of the money and she takes her son to go see her sister in Connecticut because she wants him to see a different way of living instead of the way that they see in Castle Rock. And I tried to figure out what the big problem I had with this book was, and I think I finally figured out why I don't really like it. It does seem to drag, and it does seem to spend a lot of time on extraneous events, and I think that's because at the core, this book is basically a short story trying really, really, really hard to be a novel. And it's not quite succeeding. This would work as a short story. Tighter focus on the dog and what was going around. If you take the story of the dog and the story of Cujo and the final battle, and that's really the focus, but it spends a lot of time on extraneous events. I don't feel we really need to know all about Vic's advertising business. I don't think we need to really get into the affair. I don't think we need to get into a lot of that stuff. To me, that felt extraneous. That felt like so much window dressing. That felt like filler. It felt like extra information and extra material that was being used to take a short story and to poof it out into novel length. And that is where I think Cujo doesn't live up to King's other works. I know a lot of people like Cujo. I know Stephen King likes Cujo. I know a lot of people like the movie. I know a lot of people have liked the books. To me, I just really couldn't get into it. Now, it is the second Castle Rock story, so this is where we really begin to see the Castle Rock as a town. And what I like is at the very beginning, there's a page or two that talks about the Dead Zone. So in kind of a way, there is it's a de facto sequel to the Dead Zone because it talks about the events of the Dead Zone. It talks about the killer from the Dead Zone, talks about Johnny Smith, and talks about kind of what happened in the story of the Dead Zone. So this is by default kind of a sequel or an extension of the Dead Zone. So you don't really have to read the Dead Zone. If you don't want to, you could just read Cujo and read the synopsis at the beginning of Cujo, which is about a page and a half long. There is not a lot of supernatural in this book, although it is highly insinuated. Two things are very highly insinuated in the book, never explicitly talked about, but insinuated, that Tad's afraid of the monsters in his closet, and it's pretty heavily insinuated that there is something supernatural living in his closet. It's also pretty heavily insinuated that in addition to rabies, that maybe Cujo, something supernatural is going on with Cujo. And overall, you get the impression that it's very heavily insinuated that the killer, the ghost of the killer from the Dead Zone, is actually inhabiting Tad's closet and may in fact be possessing Cujo. That's not explicitly stated, but it is insinuated. And that's where the supernatural bit comes in. Again, I think it's extraneous. I don't think it's needed. I don't think we need that supernatural bit. I think the idea of a rabid dog going on a killing rampage stands on its own. And it doesn't need all that extra stuff. It doesn't need the supernatural. It doesn't need all the extra trappings. Because the idea of a killer dog sieging a mom and a 4-year-old child in their car over the course of 3 days, I think that works of itself. And I wish King had just sort of stayed with that. Maybe Cujo should have been a short story. Maybe a novella. I don't think it needed to be a novel. I don't think there was enough material there to be a novel. I think King was trying too hard. I think he was making something out of nothing, and I think he was trying to add bloat and material to the story to make it a novel. The characters were pretty good. The characters almost felt like a template for some later on King characters. The story, the characters of Charity and Joe Camber, in a lot of ways, felt like an early draft to me of Dolores Claiborne and her husband Joe. The dynamic that they had going on between the two of them, that relationship. This felt like an early draft of what would later become Dolores and Joe Claiborne. So a lot of the characters that you see in this story feel like maybe templates or first drafts or early runs of characters that we will see in other Stephen King stories that are more fleshed out and more interesting. The characters were, more or less fairly well written. You did feel sort of sorry for the child Tad. Because of what happens in the book. And you also really do feel sorry for Cujo, because you know that Cujo, it's not really his fault. He got the bad end of the luck, and he wound up, getting rabies, and he wound up succumbing to a disease, and he wound up doing things that ultimately weren't his fault. So even though he's the villain in this story, you feel bad for him, because you do understand that it's not Cujo's fault. It's really not his fault. He is more or less a victim of fate or nature or a degenerative neurological disease. And it's not really something that he would have chosen to do. But unfortunately, he didn't choose it, and he became a victim of this awful disease. So you did feel bad for the dog. I will say that the final battle between Donna and Cujo is fairly graphic. If you are a dog person, if you are a dog lover, it may potentially be hard for you to read, because Cujo does some pretty bad things in the book, and pretty bad things are done to Cujo in order to stop him from doing what he's doing. So parts of that can be a little heavy and a little hard to read if you are a dog lover or the person that really loves animals. That part might be uncomfortable, because it does get graphic, it does get violent, both what he does and what happens to him. So overall, I was really disappointed in Cujo. I knew going into this that I was not looking forward to reading it, and as I read it, I realized I wasn't looking forward to reading it. I didn't want to read it, but I read it because it's part of what we're going on right now. I wanted to read the Castle Rock stories, and I wasn't disappointed. The movie of Cujo is slightly better just because it's faster paced, and it gets you get everything visually, and you don't have to really kind of slog through the book. You can get it about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half, and you can get the gist of the story. And the movie of the book has, if you're familiar with the book and the movie does have a different ending than the book. I'm not going to really spoil the endings, but the ending of the movie is significantly different than the ending of the book. And Stephen King himself has said that if he could go back and rewrite Cujo, he would change the ending. I wouldn't change the ending. I really wouldn't. But he said he would, because he didn't really care for the way And maybe that's just hindsight talking. Maybe that's just him looking back 30 years ago and going, you know, I could have done something better with that book. I mean, overall, I'm impressed that this is a 370-page novel that Stephen King has churned out and has absolutely no memory of writing, which basically means that even completely inebriated, out of his mind, and doesn't remember a thing, Stephen King can still write better than most people can write. Completely there, completely awake, completely lucid. You know, the writing is not bad. I really don't like it. And unfortunately, I'm going to give this out of a 5-star. This is probably going to be the one and only time I'm going to give a Stephen King book a 1-star. 1 star out of 5 for Cujo, because I just couldn't get into it. There was too much distraction going on. Stuff in it felt irrelevant. He just seemed to meander, and we started there. And the other thing is, there are no chapter breaks in this book. There are no chapter breaks. It's just one big long story, and it switches viewpoints from, you know, Tad to the Trentons to the Cambers to other people, and it kind of goes back and forth a little bit. So it feels unstructured at some points, and sometimes you have a hard time following who's doing what and who's where. But unfortunately, I think this would have worked tremendously as a short story. It may have even worked as a novella, but as a full-length novel, I just think there's too much bloat, too much extraneous information, too much irrelevant information. Didn't focus on what it should have focused on, which was the dog, the rabies, the Cujo, the standoff, and it just didn't do it for me. So this is going to get a 1 out of 5 stars. This is my least favorite Stephen King novel. And boy, I am glad we are over that hump. I'm glad we're over it. I'm glad it's done. I'm glad I don't have to read it again. Thank God. So, there's my review of Cujo. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me. That's okay. If you agree with me, comment below. If you disagree with me, comment below. What I especially like about doing these kinds of videos is that it promotes dialogue and talking. Sometimes it promotes arguments, but people get to talking back and forth and discussing, you know, whether you agree with me, whether you don't agree with me. It gets people talking, gets people chatting. And I like that. I like to read the comments. I like to see what people are talking about, what their opinions are. You know, if your opinion vastly differs than mine, let me know. I will be glad to entertain it. I like to hear what other people think of stories. I like to hear what other people think of my reviews. I like to hear what other people think of other people's comments. I like that it generates dialogue. So dialogue it up down in the comments below, and we'll have a discussion about Cujo. So that's my review. We're on the second. That was the second book on the Castle Rock tour. The third book on the Castle Rock tour is actually not a book; it's a novella. It is The Body, which is a novella out of different seasons. So I will be reading that novella. I won't be reading all of different seasons. I will just be reading The Body. We can discuss different seasons as its own book later, but right now, since we're focusing on Castle Rock, we're going to be talking about The Body at the next book review. So, guys, there it is. Comment and subscribe. Let me know. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, and until next time, I will see you in the next video.